thank you so much for the introduction. So as John mentioned, I am the Kelp Restoration Manager for the joint project between the Greater Farallones Association and the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary as a NOAA affiliate. And I'm going to be giving a presentation today about our kelp habitat restoration project in Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, which just really kind of launched this year in terms of on-the-ground restoration work through our pilot phase of our project. And I'm going to be touching on next steps for our project, future research, kind of where we're at currently right now. But I did, before jumping into all of that, want to extend a special thank you to our kelp restoration team, which a few of those folks are here, but that includes Angela Zepp, Julieta Gomez, Dr. Gina Consolini, and Tyler Mears. So without these folks, most of this work would not even be possible, so thank you. So I'm going to jump in with a little bit of background on the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary and our project and kind of why we were established. So this area you can see on the map, it's actually a tiny bit outdated, but I'll talk about kind of why that is. So you can see, see if I can use my pointer. Oh, perfect. Okay. So Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary is an area of just over 3,000 square miles that extends from just outside the Golden Gate Bridge all the way up to Point Arena, actually just past Point Arena to Manchester. And it's an area of federally protected ocean space. And the sanctuary manages subtidal habitats, everything from deep sea coral to kelp forests along the coastline, and protects those habitats against certain types of impacts and disturbances, and also works to protect wildlife disturbance and conducts research on habitats and organisms in the sanctuary. So the superintendent for our sanctuary actually also manages Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuary, which is out here, and the northern portion of Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. But our project is based largely along the Sonoma and southern Mendocino coastline. So that's why we specifically say we're partnered with GFNMS for our kelp restoration work. So that's just a little bit of background on the sanctuary. We have a couple of offices that are based, one in San Francisco on Crissy Fields, and one that's out in Olema in Point Reyes. But now we have this amazing field office here at Bodega Marine Lab, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But we have some amazing work that's happening here and a great partnership with UC Davis as well. So a little bit of the impetus and background to our project. Some of this I think folks might be pretty familiar with, but I'll just do kind of the high level overview. So we know that starting in 2013, 2014, there was this really extensive regional decline of kelp forests along the Sonoma and Mendocino County coastline, particularly within the sanctuary, the GFNMS. And so that loss of kelp forest habitat has persisted up through this year. And in 2018, the Greater Farallones Sanctuary Advisory Council put together a kelp recovery working group that was very diverse. It had folks representing different sectors from nonprofit, academic agencies, or academic groups, agencies, both state and federal, as well as stakeholders and tribes, and brought kind of everyone together to look at this extensive decline and evaluate what we know about the decline, what we don't know, and then develop a set of recommendations for the sanctuary to take in partnership with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so those recommendations were actually collated into a bull kelp or a Sonoma Mendocino bull kelp restoration plan. And you can find this on our website. But it basically outlines what those recommendations are along with strategies to implement them. And so those recommendations really formed the foundation of our kelp restoration project. That's the joint partnership between GFA and GFNMS. Since 2019, we've been working to implement those strategies, and they include recommendations for research, monitoring, on-the-ground restoration, and community engagement. So we tried to take a whole picture approach to the issue of kelp restoration, as well as kind of in addition to on-the-ground restoration work. And then in 2022 and 2023, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few slides, but we received state and federal funding to conduct restoration and research in the sanctuary. And I didn't want to dig too much into this because I think folks are fairly familiar with the issues at this point in time, but I'm happy to dig into it with questions if there are those later. But we know that, as I mentioned, in that 2013 to 2014, 2015 timeframe, that there was this really significant loss of kelp forest habitat, and there was this major shift from healthy kelp forests to urchin-dominated conditions, or urchin barrens, as we like to term them. And so we really lost a lot of ecosystem function during this time. And what our project is really focused on is looking at these very specific, very key areas that may potentially have high restoration potential, and kind of take a multi-pronged approach to kelp restoration or kelp habitat restoration, and elicit a phase shift back to healthy kelp forest habitat in these key areas. And then over the long term, hopefully that will help facilitate a more broad scale recovery of kelp forest habitat in the sanctuary. So our overall goal of our kelp restoration project is to implement those recommendations that I talked about a moment ago and restore kelp forest habitat in Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. And to achieve this, as I mentioned, we're looking at taking that approach from different restoration methods and focusing on 3 to 4 sites over 5 to 7 years in the sanctuary. Specifically within these areas that the Sanctuary Advisory Council determined may have relatively high restoration potential. And I'll talk kind of more about what that means in a moment. Also to inform both state and federal strategic kelp forest habitat restoration and management in the sanctuary. And hopefully the applications would extend beyond the sanctuary as well. Investigate trends and establish parameters surrounding response to future kelp loss events, which a lot of other groups are also working on. And so we'd love to kind of think about ways that we can help facilitate that discussion and advance our knowledge and experience and expertise surrounding how do we plan for future kelp loss events. And then identify opportunities to increase resilience of kelp forests to climate fluctuations or changing ocean conditions, which is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing in the coming years from our perspective. So this is the overall snapshot of our project. Obviously, there's quite a few minute details that we would love to dig into, but given limited time, I just wanted to give kind of the overview at this point. So this is also kind of a lot of text to digest, but this is basically a very high-level overview of all of our various projects and funding opportunities. I mentioned that in between last year and this year, 2022 to 2023, we've been awarded state and federal funding. That kind of kicked off with appropriations from Congress. So Congress set aside a chunk of funding to basically task GFA with initiating a kelp restoration project in the sanctuary and starting that project at Fort Ross Cove. That's our kind of main site where we're launching all of these efforts between this year and next year. And that funding extends for 4 years, starting last year. The Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, as part of the NOAA disaster relief funding, funded our project to defend both remnant and emergent kelp forest growth across all 4 sites, which really kind of ended up being at one site this year because there's not that much kelp out there. But we really focused in on Timber Cove in the sanctuary. Then the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation actually funded us for 2 different projects. One is focused in Drakes Bay, testing novel kelp restoration techniques and monitoring and investigating interconnectivity between the estuary and kelp forest habitat in Drakes Bay. And then they also supported grazer suppression and outplanting, as well as a hydrodynamic study to investigate coastal resilience in Sonoma. And so that project is really kind of just kicked off, but really gaining momentum starting next year. And that project's kind of in partnership with quite a few different academic institutions. And then we received some state funding from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to implement population management of urchins, or grazer suppression, and outplanting at Timber Cove. And then more recently, and if anyone has seen the Bay Nature article from the Wild Billions Project, we received funding from NOAA's Office of Habitat Conservation, a little less than $5 million over 4 years, to support restoration across 3 sites. So this is just giving some kind of the high level quick overview snapshot. Between these various projects, we're partnered with 6 different academic institutions, very closely with the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, as well as the California Department of Fish and Wildlife for certain aspects of the project. And really looking at how we can build a lot of scientific integrity, as well as informed management for throughout these projects. So just super high level overview. And I'm hoping in the future for individual presentations, we can kind of really dig into the specifics of some of these. So this is just to show our sites in Sonoma. I know this is kind of a zoomed out map, but what you see here, to give a little orientation, down here is Spud Point Marina and the lab. And then up this coast, this is a little over 20 miles from the coast, or from the bay down here. We have our restoration work starting at Fort Ross Cove and Timber Cove through a pilot project, like I mentioned this year. But we also monitor and will be conducting research at these other sites along the coast. And then next year, we'll really be starting the scaled up restoration efforts at Fort Ross Cove, Timber Cove, and Ocean Cove. So this is giving a little bit of an orientation to our extent, the spatial extent of our project. But as of right now, we're really kind of focused on Timber Cove and Fort Ross Cove, and that's where our pilot work comes into play for this year, which I'll talk more about in a sec. So those are our Sonoma restoration sites. Now, the techniques that we're using are multifold. So we started basically with the kelp restoration plan, looking at areas that have high restoration potential. We recognize the challenge of going out and trying to restore kelp forests along hundreds of miles of the California coastline. It's just not really feasible to do that. And so we wanted to dial in efforts at these areas where we see high historical kelp persistence, as well as post-decline kelp persistence. So areas where there's remnant and emergent kelp beds in the sanctuary that overlay with historical persistence. And then as well as looking at areas where there's a lot of historical data that we can compare some of our work to. A huge part of that was accessibility. A lot of these areas along the Sonoma coastline are not very accessible. So that was a huge part of kind of factoring in how we determined the sites that we were looking at. And then areas of cultural and economic importance in the sanctuary. So if you're interested in more kind of on that site selection process, and the decision-making tools that we use to look at these sites, that is all contained within the Sonoma-Mendocino Bull Kelp Restoration Plan. And so when I say a multi-pronged restoration approach, we want to be able to use multiple methods that complement each other to restore kelp forest habitat. And that really focuses on the most immediate stressor, which is reducing grazing pressure. If you are a diver, any divers in the room? See quite a few hands, our team, of course. So if you've been diving along the California coastline in Northern California and Sonoma specifically, you've probably seen a lot of urchins. And so that's the most immediate stressor or inhibitor for facilitating kelp forest recovery. And so we prioritize that first and foremost, which I'll talk more about in a minute, and kind of the work that we've already done this year. But that involves hand removal of purple urchins mainly at these sites to reduce their population density. And so we work with commercial urchin divers, local commercial divers that will go out to these sites, remove those urchins. They come back to Bodega Bay, land them, and we basically buy those urchins from them. As a fish receiver, we now have our business license as a fish receiver. And so that I'll talk a little bit more about those in just a minute, what those landings look like. And then kelp enhancement, which boils down to basically outplanting at this point in time. So we culture bull kelp in the lab, both here at BML and then also at Moss Landing Marine Labs, in partnership with Sonoma State and Moss Landing. They both work really closely with us to outplant bull kelp at these restoration sites. And we've done a bit of this year. We had a little pilot project that we started at Fort Ross with outplanting, but we're looking to scale those efforts up starting next year. And then defending remnant and emergent kelp beds. I mentioned this a couple of times. We really want to protect the kelp that still does exist in the sanctuary. There's very little of it. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but if you've been out along the coastline, there really isn't much kelp left in Sonoma. But there is some significant kelp that has persisted at Timber Cove in particular. And so we have really been seeking efforts and ways that we can protect that kelp and help grow those kelp beds and target those restoration efforts within those kelp beds. So we also eventually, hopefully starting this next year with our environmental monitoring, hopefully better understand why kelp persists at Timber Cove and then possibly in other areas. So those are kind of our overall techniques. We, as I mentioned, are culturing bull kelp here at Bodega Marine Lab, or we have been this year. So these are amazing scientists, Julieta Gomez and Rachel Karm with Sonoma State. And so we have several tanks here at BML. We have an outdoor tumble culture, and then we also have some twine cultured with bull kelp sporophytes that we've grown here in the lab. And you can see little baby kelps here. So this is super high level, but I did want to mention that Rachel and Julieta are giving a talk on November 17th, I believe, here at the lab. So definitely tune into that to learn more about our outplanting and culture techniques that we've done for our project. So we also have done a few weeks of urchin removals. This, again, is just a quick snapshot, and our project lead on kind of working with the divers and processing this data is Dr. Gina Consolini, which you can see the back of her head right here. So we have basically logged about 33 diver days and 110 hours underwater, working with 5 local commercial urchin divers that are based here in Bodega Bay, as well as we have one that's based in Sausalito and then one that's up in Jenner. But mostly they go out of Bodega Bay, trek all the way up the coast to our 2 sites where they've been doing urchin removals, which is Timber Cove and Fort Ross Cove. And over that 33 days, they have removed 16,000 pounds of urchins, and which we know is approximately around 120,000 urchins. And we know this because our amazing team, you can see Angela and Tyler here, counting urchins. So these big bins are basically what holds the urchins after they're offloaded from the urchin boat. They fill up these bins with urchins, and then we sat there and counted every single urchin that was in that bin, which took a couple of hours. And I think just in that bin alone, it was about 5,500 some odd number of urchins. And so we can basically kind of estimate about how many urchins are in there. And we'll probably do this at least a few more times next year to really gauge kind of how many urchins are being removed, because we obviously can't count every single urchin, but we do need to report every single urchin. So we do our best to estimate that. But 16,000 pounds is a lot of urchins. So this was really, again, pilot phase of our project, understanding the effort that it takes, the dive effort for the commercial urchin divers to go out, remove urchins, reduce urchin densities, and then handle those logistical challenges of getting on site, kind of knowing where the restoration area is, working with those divers to remove those urchins, and then bring them back to Bodega Bay. And then those urchins are basically stored temporarily at this facility. This is Dandy Fish Company, which is right behind Lucas Wharf, if you're familiar with where they're at. And then they trek them over to a compost facility, West Marin Compost, where those urchins are composted. So that's the kind of extent of that side of the project. This next year, as I mentioned, we're scaling up, so we will have a lot more urchins that we will be removing from these sites. Now, we have a pretty robust monitoring and assessment regime that was a bit limited this year because our environmental compliance process really compressed our field season. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But we really wanted to build out a robust infrastructure for us to be able to understand how the best restoration monitoring techniques, what gives us the most information from our restoration sites, and how we can facilitate that, as well as with our partners. So it includes a regime where we're looking at subtidal ecosystem and restoration assessment surveys using modified PSCO protocols, sampling all of those urchins, dissecting them, capturing data on urchin morphometrics and gonad health, and gut contents. Environmental monitoring, we've teamed up with John Largere and Robin, and we'll be deploying moorings at each of our sites to collect data on oceanographic conditions, and really hoping we can have that be more of a longer-term established monitoring protocol. We do kelp canopy surveys in partnership with CSU Monterey Bay, as well as a few other folks. But to go out and basically put drones in the air and map kelp canopy across all of our restoration sites and adjacent sites. And that helps us capture patterns of recovery, of kelp forest dynamics, of interconnectivity between sites. And so we've been doing that since 2019 in the sanctuary. But we also have expanded that a bit to do kelp canopy surveys throughout the season. So we understand kind of what early season kelp forest growth looks like versus later in the season. And so we hope to continue those pretty robustly throughout our project. Beach rack surveys to capture data on stranded kelp and beach rack that's coming up on beaches adjacent to our restoration sites. We've yet to kind of establish what specific questions we're looking at with that, but there could be some connection and some ways that we can monitor our restoration efforts through beach rack surveys. And then intertidal ecosystem surveys are basically looking at urchins in the intertidal, and we have a restoration or research project that we will be looking at removing urchins in the intertidal as well. And we have a really amazing outreach and education program that we work with, our Limpets project, if you're familiar with the long-term monitoring and experiential training for students project, where we do urchin dissections with them, and they actually remove urchins from the intertidal. And then we talk through kelp mapping methods and intertidal monitoring methods. And that's a really amazing project that we will continue into the future as well. And so I did want to highlight really quick, I haven't really touched base on Drakes Bay, but this is adjacent to Marin County and Point Reyes National Seashore. But there is, within Drakes Bay, an area that has also experienced kelp forest decline. And so with this project, we're testing in partnership with Sonoma State University, as well as Monterey Bay Seaweeds and Fish Bio, looking at a couple of different outplanting methods. One includes cultured twine with bull kelp sporophytes wrapped around clay bricks. So that's kind of that twine that I showed you in that picture earlier, wrapped around a clay brick, and then set to Drakes Bay, where hopefully then it has a substrate and can grow into an adult, and then create spores itself for each individual bull kelp will. That's the hope. And then Fish Bio and Monterey Bay Seaweeds had another project funded by the PSMFC folks, the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, to basically have or to culture a concentrated zoospore solution which is then dusted on the reef via a reef duster is what they call it, but it's basically kind of a reverse vacuum where you can see Angela here has the backpack, and then it has a long tube that you can put down into the water, and then they pump it down and dust it over the reef. And so they're kind of in the final stages of their project as well. And we just did some outplanting this past September using both of these methods. And we'll be collating those results next spring. So this is a really fantastic, amazing project with a lot of great partners that we learned a lot from. There were a lot of kind of specific challenges associated with this project, but I'll kind of talk a little bit more about those in a minute. But Drakes Bay was a fantastic project that is then wrapping up next year as well. And then to touch base, I know this is everyone's favorite subject, permitting and compliance. But I did want to touch base on this because this year, this was such a huge part of our project, and it will be moving forward as well. If you do research or specifically also restoration in the sanctuary or anywhere along the California coastline, environmental compliance is going to be a huge part of your existence, just giving a heads up. So especially in the sanctuary, because there's multiple layers of federal permitting on top of state and then also local and county permissions and approvals. So this is just the very quick kind of snapshot of some of the things that we have been working through with our project. So on the federal level, there's the GFNMS research permit, which really included a lot of different things, but mainly consultations with essential fish habitat or National Marine Fisheries Service, tribal or local tribes, the Endangered Species Act. Specifically, we actually hired a third-party consultant to pull together a ESA and EFH report for us to evaluate kind of the impacts of our restoration work on benthic habitats and other resources in the sanctuary and marine mammals. And so that was a very extensive process that lasted maybe about 6 months between that report and consulting with those various agencies. And then also with the National Historic Preservation Act, or the NHPA, which was looking at maritime heritage resources. So each of these sites, there are shipwrecks, there's dog hole ports, there's maritime heritage that we cannot disturb, we don't want to disturb. And so there's a lot of consideration that was put into how we can potentially modify our kelp restoration methods to avoid impacting those resources, and how we can potentially train people to be able to recognize the maritime heritage resources when we see them, and how to report them. And then we have to bring in an archaeologist. This will happen next year, but a qualified maritime archaeologist that will be doing surveys of all of these sites to evaluate kind of what further evaluate what impacts our kelp restoration efforts could have on those. So, and that also includes the State Historic Preservation Officer and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Those two are involved in sort of a shorter consulting process, but basically to provide input on our project and identify what we need to, how we might need to modify our approach. So it was a little long-winded, but basically this permit takes a very long time to get. So just a heads up, if you do restoration in the sanctuary, do expect that that process will be quite extensive. And that was just a research permit. So there's a lot to do there. And then we also had some other federal permissions like National Marine Fisheries Service. The White Area ORM is basically to qualify us to do kelp canopy surveys. So there are areas in the sanctuary that are called overflight zones, which are meant to protect wildlife from disturbance, specifically from planes and drones and things like that. And so they prevent any aircraft from flying beneath 1,000 feet. But our kelp canopy surveys need to be done at 400 feet. So we need to get special permission to be able to fly drones in those areas. So there's multiple federal permissions involved in that. So we can actually map within these areas, but it is extensively permitted to put drones in the air. Okay, so, and then the last piece of all of the federal components is the National Environmental Protection Act, or the NEPA, which is newer on our end to go through, but basically it just means that we've checked off all of our other permits, both state and federal, and that we've done those consultations, and that we understand the impacts on EFH and ESA. So NEPA, surprisingly, was the most simple part of our project, and it definitely wasn't simple. So just kind of flagging all of those federal permissions. And then state permits and approvals include scientific collection permits to collect bulk kelp and outplant bulk kelp. We had a couple of SCPs, or scientific collection permits, for collecting urchins and conducting a couple of research projects in the sanctuary. And those are required for our federal permit too. So just noting these things are interconnected. And so CDFW was another lengthy permitting process, just noting to get those SCPs in pretty early. State Parks permits us for drone flights that we launch from state lands, including Fort Ross and Gersel Cove, so we need their permission to fly in those areas in addition to the overflight zones. California State Lands Commission, they lease land to different groups that may have some activities that have impacts on the benthic habitat. And then the California Coastal Commission also permits activities that have a benthic impact or anything going into the water at our restoration sites. The California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, is something that we actually have not done yet for our project. We may possibly in the future, but we may also be exempt from it. But it's another permitting process just to be aware of, especially if your project is over 5 acres, which ours definitely is. I don't know if I mentioned the extent of our project, but we're looking to restore about 30 acres as of right now for our various projects in the sanctuary. And then local permissions and approvals. County Parks needs to issue a permit if you are launching from a county park along the coastline, like Stillwater Cove. You have to get a special use permit for activities like that. So just noting, and when I say launch, I mean a drone for kelp canopy service. So just noting any activities that could constitute any type of event at a county park needs to be permitted. And then coastal communities, by this, I mean, it's very polite to notify folks if you're doing work along the coastline. There are certain groups that kind of manage coastal activities, like the Coastal Stewardship Task Force up in Sea Ranch, and you do need permission from them to do certain activities along the coast. And so coastal communities, you just really want to make sure they're kept informed, and this is, we really try with our project to keep people informed, to keep them involved, to let them know when we're going to be on the coast doing different things. And just so that they can be aware of our activities, and then there for anything like permits or approvals that we need to notify the community, then we have to kind of be on top of that. So I'm sure that was a very exciting overview for everyone, but I just wanted to go over this today because it is really, really important for restoration and research in the sanctuary. And I think that it has been missed with other projects occasionally. So it's just really good to kind of know how all of these things intertwine and that they need to be done. Okay, so I did want to touch just really quick on challenges. I obviously just went through all the environmental compliance challenges, but in addition to that, accessibility is a big one for us because our sites are pretty remote along the Sonoma County coastline. And so being able to access them both by shore and by vessel, by research vessel, can be pretty tough sometimes, depending on conditions. Sometimes we might reserve, a research vessel for a couple of weeks, but then only get a couple of days on the ocean. And so we have been kind of thinking about ways to address that. And now we have our small boat, which is now housed here at BML. And hopefully we'll be able to use that in the future on site at our restoration sites. But accessibility is definitely a big one, and it's a pretty big challenge. for these sites that are quite remote. And that ties also into dynamic weather and ocean conditions. You can never really plan that far ahead. Here in Sonoma County, if you guys do research along the coast, you know this. But it can definitely be quite a challenge sometimes. But that's also one of the most amazing things about this coastline, I think, is just kind of how wild everything is. And being able to adapt our project to deal with these things is so important, because it will continue to be a challenge. Equipment reliability and issues, we learned, particularly during our Drakes Bay cruise, that if anything can stop working, it will. And so we've had some challenges with our small boats working. Our drones can not work, but also crash land occasionally. Only once. But also we have some challenges with any type of equipment. Here I listed drone and our ROV, but you can always plan on something not working in the field. So just having a backup plan is so incredibly important. And then of course there's inherent challenges associated with testing novel kelp restoration techniques in these areas that are really remote with limited accessibility. There's always going to be quite a few challenges that will pop up. And I would say the most important part of all of this is having a backup plan or having an alternative strategy to make sure that the work still gets done. Having a longer field season, that's something that we had a pretty challenging time with this year. Like I mentioned, environmental compliance really pushed our timetable back and squished us into a really compressed field season because our permits and approvals hadn't gone through yet. And so that's why I'm emphasizing these various pieces, is that all of this takes a very long time to facilitate and to put together. And so those are just some of the challenges that we encountered this year. Happy to dig into details on any more of these, kind of if anyone has questions about them. But this is just, again, kind of theme of the day, high-level overview. Okay, and then I did want to touch just really quickly on future research. So this is just a couple of bullet points on things that we would like to see funded, that we're seeking funding for. We would love to either lead aspects of this or learn from other people that are leading some of these things. But we have been looking at how we might be able to target urchin removals in specific areas where urchins may have higher reproductive potential. And by that, I mean urchins with healthier gonads that might be spawning more frequently, or kind of looking at how we can reduce those urchins within those areas. So I'm thinking like within kelp beds or within low intertidal or high subtidal areas, better understanding those dynamics and relationships between urchin and kelp and different depths across a restoration site so that we can be more efficient and targeted with our restoration efforts. Defending remnant and emergent kelp, again, I've mentioned this several times, but it's really important to try and focus at least some efforts on these areas where kelp still exists, because in the sanctuary it is very rare. So when we find it, we want to protect it or defend it as much as we possibly can. So that we've been doing this year at Timber Cove, and we hope to continue that work into the future. Expanding our grazer suppression methods and toolkit. So right now our project focuses entirely on removing urchins by hand in the subtidal, but we would like to investigate how we can remove urchins in the intertidal areas, as well as potentially understand. So this may not be a method that we use in the future, but we do want to understand what urchin crushing if urchin crushing could be used as a tool in the future, what impacts it has on the reef, what ecosystem impacts there are. And so we will be leading a small scale project looking at all of those things for actually crushing urchins in situ underwater in the sanctuary. And we know this has been used in other areas, but we do not use it currently with our project. We need to understand more about it before we ever use it as an actual tool. So we will just be doing it in a very small area in the sanctuary. And then with our partners as the leads, looking at how to culture heat-resilient bulk kelp in the lab. So not outplanting bulk kelp, but just culturing it in the lab and understanding what techniques could be used to do that, and if it's possible, and understanding whether that could be part of a toolkit in the future for restoration. Okay, so next steps. In 2023 and 2024. So all of this that I've kind of talked about up to this point on what we've already done has been the pilot phase of our project, which will be informing the next steps and scaling up restoration. So we need to dig a little bit more into analyzing data from the past couple of years, the work that we've done this year, but also some of our like restoration surveys. And use that information to finish developing our implementation plan, specifically for 2024, but we do need to look out to the next few years, at least up through 2027, completing our environmental compliance and permitting process, hopefully for the next 3 years. It would be really fantastic if we could get it kind of checked off for a certain time frame, but knowing that our project is likely to be informed very heavily as we go along. I think that there's going to be permitting and compliance is going to happen throughout our project as we learn what methods really work well, if we need to adjust things. But at this point in time, we really want to set a really strong framework in place for 2024 to make sure that we have a nice long field season and we can get started early in the year. Scaling up restoration efforts and implementing several projects in 2024. So that includes, as I mentioned earlier, scaling up restoration at Fort Ross and Timber Cove as our 2 main sites, begin restoration at Ocean Cove, which is our 3rd site, environmental monitoring, so kicking off deploying those moorings and sensors so that we can start capturing that data, research on hydrodynamics at Fort Ross and Timber Cove, to understand potential impacts of restored kelp forests on coastal resilience. And then continuing some outreach and engagement, which I didn't really talk too much about, but is a huge part of our project, particularly stakeholder engagement, and kind of understanding some of the impacts of our restoration work on coastal communities, as well as local tribes, and really garnering input and feedback on certain aspects of our project, but then also communicating the results of the work that we're doing to the public, and being very open and transparent about that process. So this is a huge part of the work that we do, and we have kind of quite a few folks dedicated to this in our project. And we will be working really closely with Fort Ross Conservancy in particular. If you've been up to Fort Ross, the Conservancy there will be working with us to develop some outreach materials and programming and teaching the public about our kelp restoration work, which we're really excited about. That'll be a super cool partnership. Okay. Whew. All right, we're getting to the end here. So I did just want to put up a thank you to all of these amazing folks at different groups, agencies, institutions, individuals. This work is really highly collaborative. And so I'm up here presenting, but really all of the work happens behind the scenes. And so just wanted to put this up here as a thank you to all the folks who have contributed and who are working on our project, and help facilitate different aspects of it. And then I will wrap up for questions.
Great, thanks, Rieta, that's great. If you're on Zoom, please post questions in chat, we'll try to get to them. The room, you can raise your hand. The one thing actually that I forgot to say is if, in introducing Rieta is that the team now is based at BML, or at least some of your work is based here. Do you maybe want to introduce your team, or maybe let them stand up just for anybody who does not know them? Then we know who you are.
Stand up.
Is that cool? Yeah.
Daryl's a part of our team too, so you can wave too.
You need to say your name and what you're doing, Daryl.
Hi. Yes. Hi, I can step back over.
So one of the benefits of co-locating is that we interact, and maybe that'll be my first question for you, is that are there opportunities for VML people to get involved, and if so, how? Grad students, that example.
I think there's a lot of opportunity, honestly. And I didn't acknowledge it earlier, but there's the really amazing Kelp Rises program, I think is how you pronounce it,
Yeah.
here at BML. But
Kelp Rises.
Rises, yes, Kelp Rises. That we attend the meetings and share our work, and there's a lot of really incredible research that happens with that group. But I think that moving forward, we're kind of still getting established with our project, but we're now here at BML, and it really helps facilitate a great opportunity for folks who are interested in working with us. There's definitely a lot of collaboration I could see in the future. So if anyone is interested in working with us, definitely just reach out and we can see how we might be able to assist either with getting experience in the field or potentially collaborating on any type of project.
While you're thinking about raising your hand or not, I'll take a quick question from the Zoom and then we'll go to Peter. Are there any uses for the countless sea urchins being destroyed here?
Yeah, so there's quite a few groups that are looking into different ways that sea urchins could be utilized, and I don't know how many of them are currently underway, but I do know that there's some interest in, for one, and I know this has happened here at BML, but culturing urchins that are collected from urchin barrens, feeding them an artificial kind of algae-based food, and then selling them. So kind of marketing them as a commercial product. There are some folks that may have looked into in the past into using urchins as dye and calcium supplements. I think if anyone is willing to come to the pier and pick up urchins, you're more than welcome to do that. We have so many, or we will this next year. And so that's a good area that folks can look into for sure. But as of right now, all of our urchins are destined for compost currently.
In those remnants at the full kelp that you found, have you been able to get in the water and look to know whether the extent of low, or are the full kelp survive quite?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And this year, as I mentioned, our actual surveys in Timber Cove were a bit limited. But we would expect to find lower urchin densities kind of within those kelp forests. But I'm not quite sure we can say why. There is some research looking into that other groups are doing into looking into why urchin densities might vary at one site versus another, or what might facilitate natural recovery of kelp forests. But at this time, I don't think that we have kind of a solid answer to that. But there is definitely between an urchin-dominated reef versus a remnant kelp patch, there are differences in urchin density. But I think the important piece is kind of understanding why that is. But we don't really have quite an answer to that just yet.
Thanks, Rita. I'll take one more on Zoom, and then we'll go to Eric, and then get across that side. Are there efforts underway in your program to also get more sea stars back into restoration sites?
Yeah, so I think I would guess that they're referring to sunflower stars or Pycnopodia, which we know is an important predator of urchins. And so there are other groups that are looking at that, particularly I know the Nature Conservancy and Friday Harbor Labs, like they're looking at culturing Pycnopodia or sunflower stars in the lab and kind of understanding how we might in the future be able to reintroduce them. But as of right now, I would say that we're definitely supportive of that work happening, but we're not directly leading it or involved in it just yet. but we would love in the future maybe to be able to partner on reintroducing them. But hopefully that answers the question, but I would reach out to folks who are part of the Pycnopodia working group. I think they have a lot of more information than we do.
Thanks, Vieta. That was a great overview. So the numbers of urchins, of course, are just amazing. You know, taking out 16,000 pounds from small cove. So it seems like at the scale of the Sonoma Coast, I mean, obviously there's millions and millions of urchins out there. So I'm wondering, even with a very concerted effort to remove urchins, what percentage of urchins could really be removed? I mean, it's hard to imagine taking out more than 5 or 10% of the total population, even with a huge effort. And then I guess the question associated with that is, how many urchins would have to be removed in order to have a significant impact on how they're affecting health, I guess? There's no easy answers, but I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Oh yes, such easy questions you're asking there. So we definitely don't want to go out and remove urchins along the entire coastline. So that's why we're really targeting these areas that we think have high restoration potential, which, as I mentioned, include areas of high historical persistence, kind of overlapped with where we see current persistence, meaning those remnant and emergent kelp beds. So where kelp really grows well, basically. And so we really want to dial in our efforts to those areas and hopefully create these refugia, or we're kind of cutely termed them oases, to restore these patches of kelp forest habitat that will eventually help with broad scale recovery as ocean conditions change. So we're definitely not looking at restoring kind of that entire stretch of the coastline that is far beyond our efforts, scope, ability. That would probably cost billions of dollars. But we are really dialed in at these specific areas to help replenish the bull kelp spore supply in the nearshore environment. That's really kind of what we're focused on, so that we can preserve our local bull kelp populations in the interim, and then hopefully better understand in the future how to increase climate resilience. So I know that is kind of a very kind of high level overview answer. But we're learning so much as we go along that all of these efforts, in my mind and for our project, they really, really matter for us understanding how to move forward with habitat restoration and understanding our long-term goals and how we can achieve them. But there are a lot of really difficult questions that we face about how best to do that. But I think we're going to get at answering them pretty well over the next few years.
Hi, thank you so much for the great talk. Very cool book. I'm just wondering, is there any population structure help on this part of the coast? If so, how are you specific to help?
Can you repeat your question?
Yeah, is there any population structure to help on this coast? And
Population structure meaning like genetic diversity, or
yeah,
what are you referring to?
that's genetic diversity to just help in one place, different genetically to help in another, and so how outplanting, make sure that you're still maintaining local population.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this is, if you want specifics on genetic diversity and subpopulations, a really good person to follow up is Felipe Alberto at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, because they've done a genetic study of bull kelp along the Northern California coastline. And from what I understand, there is actually a pretty high diversity, genetic diversity. But we, with our permits and approvals and permissions, when we collect bull kelp to culture, it does need to be from somewhat locally, as opposed to collecting bull kelp from Central or Southern California. We definitely need to make sure it's within this area. And our bull kelp is collected from Albion for our cultures, which is in Mendocino County. And so hopefully that answers your question, but we definitely want to select from local bull kelp populations at this time. But we did, with our study looking at, or our proposal for our study to look at heat resilient kelp, in partnership with Sonoma State and Moss Landing, we looked at collecting bull kelp from other areas in California and seeing whether there is more heat tolerance in those populations. So that would play on genetic diversity. So if that's funded, we would learn a lot more, I think. But I'm not a geneticist, so I'm kind of fumbling through the answer for this, but that's kind of just what I understand. But it's a really good question.
Thanks for the talk, and just want to honor what a huge project it's going to be over the coming years. So thanks for embarking on some important work. I had a question about the urchin divers that you work with. It seems like commercial urchin divers are kind of a dying breed a little bit, but they're pretty essential to your project in terms of getting out there and removing a lot of urchins quickly and effectively. Do you sort of have like a long-term agreement with them to keep their involvement and kind of keep them working for the project? Are they kind of seasonal, or how does that relationship work exactly?
That's an excellent question. So to acknowledge your first point, yes, there are commercial urchin divers that have moved on to other sectors, basically because they've been forced to. The red urchin fishery on the North Coast has declined dramatically since 2013. And so there's not a whole lot of their livelihood left up here. But a lot of those fishermen are also involved in other fishing sectors. So they fish for crab or for salmon, which unfortunately also was closed this year. But and then for tuna. So they are involved in other fishing kind of areas. So it doesn't mean that necessarily if they've already invested kind of in getting their, their permits, their vessels, their equipment, like living on the coast, that's huge, right? So if they can support their livelihood through some other like ocean-based venture or fishing venture, then I think they have done that. But we, as of right now, can't put into place any type of agreement or long-term agreement with any of them. But it is a very important part of our project, and we've included a lot of support in our project for urchin removals. But this is a whole separate conversation. There's a lot of complexities with contracting them. So I think what you're kind of referring to would be a long-term contract. That is very difficult for us to do given the nature of their work. There's a ton of like liability issues and insurance issues. And we have tried to work through those, but as of right now, we kind of really only offer that our project will support those urchin removals over the next few years. And then try to work with our local commercial urchin divers as much as possible. And I would say that they are a massive part of our project. Their input, consulting with us, providing insight, like working with us on what the restoration site accessibility looks like, logistics, has been so, so important. And we want to keep that aspect of our project. Like without them, our project would be really, really difficult, if not impossible. So definitely recognizing that that is pretty essential. But unfortunately, we can't put in like, we can contract you for 5 years, that kind of thing, at least not at this time. But good question.
Hi, Rieta. Great talk. Welcome to BML, all of you guys. My question is, I think, message-based, so you may or may not answer, but when it comes to the help specifically the out of for clay brick, I was wondering if you guys had trying to mitigate, I want to call it grazers coming in and just heating it up, or if that's something. This is also based on the idea of what I generally know about white abalone outplants, here to keep the small animals alive. Sometimes they're very vulnerable. They like to eat stuff, so they move out themselves. But let me know if you know the answer to that, or if you have any concerns about that.
Yeah, no, that is an excellent question. And I do want to also give Julieta a chance to supplement this answer if you would like. But ideally, yes, we would reduce grazing pressure before we put any outplants out. I think this year that has definitely been a challenge, just given kind of our condensed fieldwork window. But in Drake's Bay, we definitely haven't seen the same number of urchins that we've seen elsewhere, at least in the imagery that we've been able to capture of the benthic habitat. But yes, that is definitely what our project would be focused around, is reducing, or will be focused around, is reducing urchin grazing pressure and then outplanting so that those outplants are not gobbled up immediately. So that would be a pretty big piece. Also, just looking at how we can really kind of dial in like natural urchin barriers, like sandbars, help protect against encroachment, prioritize those outplanting sites for the urchin divers. So really keeping that urchin grazing pressure down is huge and really important. Is there anything you want to add to that?